plane hit turbulence over a nameless stretch of wilderness. One moment, I was sipping a cup of coffee, staring out the window at endless clouds, and the next, the world tilted violently. The cabin lights flickered, and the calm voice of the captain crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've encountered some unexpected turbulence. Please fasten your seatbelts and remain seated." The tone was calm, but the grip of panic was already tightening. The plane bucked again, harder this time, and gasps filled the cabin as trays and cups toppled to the floor. My fingers clutched the armrests, the chill of fear radiating from my core. The descent was sharp, suffocating. Oxygen masks dropped like pale jellyfish from the overhead panels, and alarms blared over the panicked cries of passengers. The view outside the window was a blur of clouds and green, the world spinning in chaotic spirals. The flight attendants' voices were strained, calling for calm over the rising cacophony. And then the impact came, sudden and brutal. A deafening roar of metal tearing against earth, the sickening lurch as the plane split apart like a fragile toy tossed against the ground. Darkness swallowed everything. I woke to the stillness of a broken world. My head throbbed, a dull ache blooming behind my temples as I forced my eyes open. The cabin was unrecognizable. Seats had been wrenched from the floor and flung like dice, debris littering the ground. The air reeked of fuel and smoke, tinged with the cold bite of pine and wet earth. Groaning, I unbuckled my seatbelt with shaking hands. The quiet was unnerving, broken only by the faint crackle of something burning in the distance. "Hello?" My voice was hoarse, barely audible over the blood pounding in my ears. A figure stirred nearby, a man, disoriented but alive. Others followed, climbing from the wreckage with wide, glassy eyes, clutching their arms or limping on trembling legs. We were a pitiful assembly, strangers bound by the cruel hand of fate. There were 8 of us who had survived. The forest loomed around us, a thick wall of shadowy trees that seemed to stretch forever. The air was heavy, oppressive, muffling every sound like a woolen blanket. "We need to move away from the wreckage," said a man in a pilot's uniform, first officer, judging by his badge. His voice was calm, but his eyes betrayed his fear. "If there's fuel leaking, it's dangerous to stay here." We stumbled away from the plane, the forest swallowing us like a predator closing its jaws. The wilderness was silent. Not peaceful, no chirping birds, no rustle of small creatures, just an eerie, unnatural quiet. Each step we took felt heavier, the air thick and damp. The trees stretched high above us, their gnarled branches forming a dense canopy that allowed little sunlight through. "This doesn't feel right," murmured a woman behind me. Her voice trembled, and I couldn't blame her. Something about the forest seemed alive, watching. We made camp that night near a small clearing. No one wanted to admit it aloud, but we all felt the same thing, that something was terribly wrong. The fire sputtered weakly, casting a faint glow over our makeshift camp. We huddled close, clutching our blankets as the night seeped into our bones. I kept glancing over my shoulder at the dark wall of trees, the feeling of being watched prickling at my skin. One of the other survivors, a wiry man named Jacob, leaned closer to the fire. "We need to find help tomorrow," he said, his voice low. "A search party will be looking for us, but we can't count on them finding us out here." "What makes you think they'll come?" asked Clara, the woman who had spoken earlier. Her voice carried a note of panic. "We don't even know where we are. What if no one knows we survived?" "Let's not think like that," the first officer interjected. He had introduced himself as Ethan. "Planes don't just vanish. They'll be looking for us." The conversation faltered, swallowed by the crackling of the fire and the ever-present silence beyond. Sleep came reluctantly. my mind filled with the weight of everything we had lost and the uncertainty of what lay ahead. I woke in the early hours of the morning, my breath misting in the frigid air. Something had stirred me, a sound, faint but distinct. A rustling. My heart thudded as I sat up, scanning the perimeter of the camp. The fire had dwindled to embers, and the others were still, bundled in their blankets. I strained to hear, the blood pounding in my ears. There it was again. A faint crackle, like dry leaves crushed underfoot. My gaze darted to the tree line, but the shadows were impenetrable. "Hello?" My voice trembled, barely above a whisper. No answer. I reached for the flashlight we'd salvaged from the wreckage, its beam piercing the darkness. It illuminated the trees, their trunks like silent sentinels. And then I saw it, deep in the shadows, the glint of something reflective. 2 faint points of light, like eyes, watching from the dark. The beam of the flashlight wavered as my hands trembled. When I blinked, the glint was gone, leaving only the oppressive void of the forest. I backed toward the fire, my pulse racing. The others stirred as I added more wood to the flames, the light growing brighter, pushing back the night. "Everything okay?" Ethan asked, his voice groggy. "Yeah," I lied. But I knew I hadn't imagined it. Something was out there, watching, waiting. The morning arrived reluctantly, the weak light filtering through the canopy, casting a sickly gray pall over the forest. The silence persisted, heavier in the daylight, as though the forest was holding its breath. None of us spoke of the unease from the night before, but the tension in the group was palpable. Ethan organized us into small teams to scout for supplies and a clearer view of the terrain. I paired with Clara, her nervous energy palpable as we ventured deeper into the trees. Each step felt like an intrusion, the ground damp and springy beneath our boots, the air thick with the scent of earth and decay. "This place is suffocating," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible over the crunch of leaves. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The forest was alive in ways that defied explanation. The wind didn't rustle the branches. It sighed, low and mournful, as if the trees themselves were lamenting. We stumbled upon a stream, its water running clear and cold. Relief washed over us as we filled our canteens, the mundane task offering a fleeting sense of normalcy. I was rinsing my hands when Clara gasped, clutching my arm. "Look," she whispered, pointing downstream. My eyes followed her trembling finger. Along the muddy bank were tracks, but not human ones. They were long and deep, the claw-like impressions unnervingly sharp, as though whatever made them had talons instead of feet. What could have done that?" Clara stammered. "Probably an animal," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. The tracks were unlike any I'd seen before, too deliberate, too precise. Clara backed away, her eyes darting around the trees. "We shouldn't stay here." I agreed, the uneasy weight in my chest urging me to move. As we made our way back to camp, the forest seemed to close in around us. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, and every rustle of leaves felt deliberate, like something was following, just out of sight. When we returned, the others were waiting with grim faces. Jacob stepped forward, holding something wrapped in a cloth. He unrolled it carefully, revealing a shard of metal, jagged and blackened, but unmistakably part of the plane. "We found this an hour's walk east," Jacob said. "But it wasn't scattered wreckage. It was arranged, like someone or something put it there." A chill swept over me as I met Clara's wide-eyed gaze. Ethan frowned, studying the fragment. "Arranged how?" "In a circle," Jacob replied, his voice low. "And there were more tracks, like the ones we saw near camp last night." Silence fell over the group, the implications sinking in. The tracks weren't random. Whatever was out there was aware of us, watching. That night, the forest came alive. The fire crackled weakly in the center of camp as we huddled close, speaking in hushed tones. The oppressive stillness of the night pressed against us like a heavy blanket, and every creak of the trees sent shivers down my spine. Then came the sounds, soft at first, barely audible over the crackling fire. A faint rustling, like dry leaves shifting in the wind, though the air was still. "Did you hear that?" Clara whispered, her hand gripping my arm. The others fell silent, their gazes darting toward the shadows. The rustling grew louder, closer, and was joined by a low, rhythmic clicking, as if something was snapping its claws in anticipation. "It's just an animal," Ethan said, his voice steady but strained. "Stay calm." But the clicking didn't sound like any animal I knew. It was deliberate, calculated, and it circled the camp like a predator testing its prey. I shone my flashlight toward the trees, the beam cutting through the darkness. For a fleeting moment, I saw movement, branches bending without wind, shadows shifting unnaturally. And then, just as suddenly, it was gone. "Keep the fire going," Ethan ordered. "Whatever it is, it doesn't like the light." We fed the flames, the glow pushing back the encroaching dark. But the noises didn't stop. They grew louder, the clicking overlapping into a dissonant rhythm that filled the air with dread. Sleep was impossible that night. I sat with my back to the fire, my eyes fixed on the shifting shadows, the relentless sense of being watched gnawing at my sanity. By dawn, we were exhausted, our nerves frayed from the night's ordeal. The noises had stopped just before sunrise, leaving a hollow silence that felt more unsettling than the sounds themselves. Jacob tinkered with the emergency radio we had salvaged from the wreckage, his brows furrowed in concentration. For hours we waited, the static of the radio filling the air like white noise in a nightmare. Then, faint and crackling, a voice broke through. "Survivors. Location. Repeat." Jacob's head shot up, his eyes wide with hope. "It's a search party. They're looking for us." The group erupted in cautious relief, but Ethan held up a hand. "Let's not celebrate yet. We need to pinpoint their location and signal them." The transmission continued, broken and distorted. The coordinates they gave were only a few miles north, a manageable trek. But the joy was short-lived. As we packed our gear, the forest began to shift. The trees seemed taller, their branches weaving together to form an almost impenetrable canopy. The air grew heavier, the silence deeper, as though the wilderness itself was reacting to our plans. The trail was treacherous, the ground uneven and slick with moss. The sense of being followed never left us. I caught glimpses of movement in the periphery, dark shapes darting between the trees, too fast and fluid to be human. The clicking returned, louder now, echoing through the forest like a macabre heartbeat. Clara stumbled, clutching my arm as her breathing quickened. "We're being herded," she whispered, her voice trembling. She was right. The path seemed to curve unnaturally, leading us away from the coordinates, deeper into the forest's heart. "We need to turn back," I said, but Ethan shook his head. "No," he said firmly. "If we stop now, we'll lose everything. We keep going." The tension was unbearable, the forest closing in around us like a living thing. As we pressed on, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into a trap, that whatever was out there wanted us to keep moving. Toward what? I didn't want to know. The forest seemed to breathe around us, its ancient lungs expanding and contracting with an unnatural rhythm. The air grew colder with every step, our breaths puffing out in white clouds that hung in the stillness. The faint signal from the radio had long since faded into static, leaving us to navigate by instinct alone. And yet, there was a pull, a subtle force guiding us forward, as though the forest itself wanted us to reach some predestined destination. The canopy above knitted so tightly that the daylight was reduced to a dim twilight, casting the underbrush in hues of gray and shadow. The clicking sound was ever present now, a relentless cadence that seemed to sync with our footsteps, echoing from all directions. Clara gripped my arm as we trudged through the dense terrain, her eyes darting at every sound. "This isn't right," she whispered. "We're walking into something we don't understand." She wasn't wrong. My skin crawled with the same sense of inevitability. It wasn't just the forest watching us anymore. It felt as though the very air was alive, carrying whispers too faint to discern, like secrets traded in a language older than time. We reached the clearing just as the first stars began to peek through the veiled sky. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen. The trees here bent outward, their gnarled branches forming an eerie, perfect circle around an open expanse of black earth. In the center stood a towering monolith, a jagged stone etched with symbols that pulsed faintly with a soft, green luminescence. The clicking stopped. The sudden silence was deafening, pressing against my ears like a physical force. I realized with a start that I'd stopped breathing, my chest locked in place as I stared at the impossible structure. "What is that?" Jacob murmured, his voice trembling. Ethan stepped forward, his face pale. "It's not man-made, that much is certain." None of us dared to approach it at first. The stone radiated a low hum, a vibration that seemed to seep into the ground and rise through my boots, reverberating in my bones. Then Clara pointed, her finger shaking. "Look." Around the base of the monolith were the remains of the plane wreckage. Not scattered debris, but arranged in an intricate spiral, each piece placed with uncanny precision. The realization hit us all at once. This wasn't random. The plane hadn't just crashed here, it had been brought here. "This place," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's drawing us in, like it's alive." Ethan crouched by the spiral, his hand hovering over one of the twisted fragments. Maybe it's some kind of signal, a way to call for help. We have to try to use it." "No," Clara's voice cracked. "It's not a signal. It's a trap. Don't you feel it? This isn't natural." Before anyone could stop him, Ethan reached out and touched the monolith. The moment his fingers made contact, the ground beneath us shuddered. The faint luminescence of the symbols grew brighter, casting an eerie glow that painted the clearing in shades of sickly green. The air pulsed with energy, a low rhythmic thrum that matched the earlier clicking sound. And then we saw them. The shadows moved. Slowly, deliberately, they detached from the trees and began to coalesce, forming tall, slender shapes that wavered at the edges, as though they were made of smoke and darkness. Their presence was wrong, an affront to every natural instinct. They moved without sound, their elongated limbs flowing unnaturally as they circled the clearing. What do they want?" Jacob stammered, his voice breaking. I didn't have an answer. The shapes didn't advance, didn't attack. They simply stood, their empty faces turned toward us as if waiting. Ethan pulled his hand back from the monolith, his face pale and strained. "It's not a signal," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's a gate." "A gate to what?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Ethan didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the symbols, which now moved across the surface of the stone like living things, shifting and rearranging themselves in hypnotic patterns. The humming grew louder, the vibration intensifying until it felt like the ground itself might shatter beneath us. The figures at the edge of the clearing began to drift closer, their forms pulsing in time with the rhythm of the monolith. "We need to leave," Clara said, clutching my arm with trembling fingers. "We need to leave right now." But as I turned, I realized the path we had entered through was gone. The forest had closed in, the trees forming an impenetrable wall of shadow. With no way out, we could only watch as the monolith reached its crescendo. The light flared once, blindingly bright, before dimming to a faint, steady glow. The figures halted, their forms still as statues. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the hum ceased. The silence returned, heavy and suffocating. The figures melted back into the shadows, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted slightly. "What just happened?" Jacob whispered, his voice barely audible. None of us answered. We didn't have to. The forest had shown us its secret, and though we didn't understand it, we knew one thing for certain. We didn't belong here. As we huddled together in the clearing, waiting for the dawn, the monolith stood silent and still, but deep in its surface, the symbols continued to shift, as though biding their time. We weren't safe. Not yet. Not ever.